Hi, my name is Isaac Fox, also known as Panda Bear Me, and recently I've stepped back from playing StarCraft 2 competitively, but I was thinking a lot about how I started playing and different things I had questions about in and out of game, and I was thinking about how a lot of the questions I've answered, but it's not very easy to figure out the answers if you're a new player still, because the way I found out a lot of those answers were through talking to other players, reading books maybe someone has suggested to me, or finding on my own, or just outright experiencing it for myself and really figuring out what works for me. And I was really thinking if I was starting today, it would be just as hard as it was back in the day to try to be a competitive player. And I really wanted to make a video for that type of person who's trying to get into a competitive field, specifically esports. And I'm mostly applying this stuff to StarCraft, but it kind of applies to everything, so you can kind of just take what you can and fit the parts where they may lay. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was ego and confidence, because I think this was one of the most important things I had to learn, that I learned a lot later than I really should have, and I had no idea I needed to learn until much later on. So I'll start with confidence. And confidence, I think, is so hard to have when you're just starting out and you're just getting into qualifiers, or even if you're kind of into doing qualifiers for a while now, if you don't really have an established result, it can feel like you really have nothing to stand on. Or even if you do have a result, it might feel a little bit flimsy and not good enough, and you can second guess yourself. Of course, you can beat everybody. Everybody can, is kind of competitive with everybody. There's always a chance, right? But to be truly confident, you really need to believe you have a pretty good chance at beating somebody. And just feeling like you could win isn't really having confidence. It's just, being realistic. And whenever I tried to address confidence, I always felt like there wasn't a solid answer. It kind of felt like a fake it till you make it kind of thing, and it never really felt right with me. But later on, I kind of developed, through talking to different people and researching certain things, a style of getting confidence that I felt like really worked for me, and I feel like really could apply to anybody. And this is basically what it is. Whenever I would compare myself to other players, people I was about to play in a tournament or a series, whatever, I always think about the bullet points of their macro, their micro. They're like the most common things that make a player good. That's everyone's foundation on how they're good as a player, and it's just the most simplest thing to look at, right? But when you're doing that as a player who isn't as good, it's never going to go well for you. It's 90% of the time you're going to fall off short. They're going to be better at macroing than you. And the other 10% of the time, you're going to be even. Like at best, you're going to be even when you're really the lower level of these tournaments. And it really seemed like there was no way around this thing. But what I found is, rather than focusing on these very core mechanics, which are important, but instead of focusing on these mechanics, focus on something, a skill you have already. It could be mechanical, it could be more of an out-of-game thing, a way you approach series perhaps, but a skill you have that you can take that's not so common, and then you really hone the skill, and then you use this as your pride approaching the series. And when you have this thing that's not as common, it's harder to deal with. So I'll give you an example of one of the things I had. One of them was I was really into creep spreading in ZVT. I didn't make like 9 queens every game, but I was pretty good at keeping it on cooldown. I spread pretty well. I do a normal amount of queens. You don't have to do a normal. You could emphasize it super hard and make that your thing, but you don't necessarily have to. For me, it was just a bonus where I knew I had good creep spread, And not everybody's good at clearing creep, not everybody's good at making creep, so I knew it wasn't common enough that just because they were better than me, they would be super good at doing this thing, right? It was a little bit more different than that, because there's some things that are just a given. If you're a higher level player, you're just good at this thing. But clearing creep wasn't necessarily one of those things that I found. And as long as I kept up the skill, even if they were good at clearing creep, it would still be out further than it would have been if I hadn't. And that would make the difference. In ZVT games, it was the difference between taking my fourth or not. It was a very important skill, and it just gave me kind of this thing in my back pocket that I could always say, well, I don't have the greatest macro, this guy's a little bit better, but if I make it to the mid game, I can secure my fourth and then, hold it and then get the fifth base, and it just snowballs, And if I'm behind, that can help me get back in. If I'm even, maybe that'll give me the edge, right? It just kind of applies to a lot of things, and it really gave me something that I could believe in, even though I didn't have the greatest macro compared to that guy, right? And everyone has a skill or multiple skills that they're good at, and if it happens to apply to all matchups, that's great. It makes it super easy, but usually it'll be something like creep spread where it's only really good in ZVT, and ZVP it's fine, and ZVZ it's not at all. It's okay to have a couple, but everyone has something they're good at already, and it's just about finding that style. And you really have to be honest with yourself what you're good at, and if you really can't find what you're good at, you feel like you're kind of a jack of all trades, maybe look at more of an out of game skills you have, maybe approaching series, you have an eye for things, or maybe just ask a friend of yours that you feel is pretty honest with you that you could ask, or just go down the list, just do the thing you love doing the most and see if are you honestly good at this thing, or do you just like doing it, and then keep going down, because a lot of things I was good at I didn't necessarily like, or maybe you'll be okay with it, but it kind of lends itself to a style that you might not like. If you're very good creep spread and you're kind of a cheeser, it's you're not going to be able to do that very much hand in hand. So you got to be honest with yourself if it's something, even if you don't like. But if you find this thing, you really need to keep it up too, though, even though you're good at it already, and it's probably a lot better than the people your skill level at that thing. You need to keep it up and make sure that you can't question this thing versus anybody when you're in a qualifier or something, you know what I mean? Like, if I'll go back to the creep spread example. If you're really good at creep spread and you're versus a really good player, and you're like, oh man, what if it's not good enough versus this guy? That's a bad situation to be in, because that should be your last standing guard that you have, to always be like, I have something in my back pocket. If that's not good enough, then you need to hone that skill a little bit more. And you don't have to focus everything on that, but just keep that in mind when you're in practice. You're already working on your mechanics, but keep an extra eye. Could I have done these things better? Would this been out, would have been out a little bit further on the map if I was more efficient? Just keep an eye on that and keep it going, and then it'll just happen naturally. You don't have to drill it that hard, really. But if you feel like you do, then do. But it just comes down to the situation. But another issue people have with confidence is when they have lack of confidence, they end up switching up their build orders a lot at the last second. I know even really good players that even attended BlizzCon that have told me that they switched up their build orders at the last second because somebody told them that such and such would be better. And whether you're unfamiliar or not, you should not do something you didn't plan for, especially if you're unfamiliar with it. But when you're practicing for something for months, it just makes sense to totally switch up your plan, because it just ruins all that practice. Because if you practice for months and months of a certain build orders that you prepared, and then you don't do those build orders, you don't have any reference for how far you've come, and it really hurts your practice in the long run. And that's something I've done a couple times that I've really regretted, because I would drill these builds, and then at the last second I'd be like, man, this other build would be a little bit better versus this guy, and it wouldn't even be what I was practicing. I might have known the build, but it didn't really matter. I had no idea how much better I got at the matchup because I did this random build, and win or lose, it doesn't really matter because I have no reference now. In a tournament setting, I don't know how good I am with this thing, and it just completely ruined it. And I think that's a really important thing that's related to confidence. And that's pretty much all I had to say about confidence that I can think of. But moving on to ego, which is the next topic for this video. Ego, I think a lot of people think of it as like when you're putting yourself up and you're putting a lot of other people down and you're just kind of feeling like you can beat anybody. It can be mistaken for confidence a lot because on the outside it could easily be mistaken as confidence when you're saying how you can beat everybody, and usually you are when you're saying and feeling like this. And then what eventually inevitably happens, unless you're just super arrogant and then deny why you're losing, if you're honest about why you're losing, what ends up inevitably happening is you feel terrible, and you say all this stuff about how bad these players are in your head and all their weaknesses, and then you lose these people, you just feel terrible, and it snowballs. And then it's like, if they're bad at all these things that I pointed out and I lose them, then I must be even worse. And both of these things are the same in a lot of ways. They're both ego, they're just different stages of ego. And if you're stuck in the first stage of ego, then you might have an even bigger problem of self-reflection on where you're really at as a player, because you might just be losing a lot and blaming everything else but yourself, and that could be even worse. But what it comes down to, both of them, no matter what stage you're stuck in, is simply just respecting the players you're playing and what you're good at when they're bad at, and what they're good at and what you're bad at. And it all just comes together a lot better, because there's so many people who will disrespect styles just because they're a little bit cheesy, a little bit abnormal, off meta builds, right? Coin flips, the works. If you play a player like this, it's just all those things, and you're really telling yourself like, I should beat this guy easy peasy as long as I hit 6 minutes plus. And that's fine to say something like that, but you shouldn't say, oh, it's fine to say you'll win when you hit 6 minutes plus, but you shouldn't say it's easy to get there, because the reality is that hitting 6 minutes is going to be really hard if it's that easy to beat him after 6 minutes, because obviously this guy only plays pre 6 minutes, and it might be hard just because it's coin flips or whatever, and it's just weird off meta stuff. Even so, you still have to respect it for what it is, and really objectively look at what the builds you're working with are, because a lot of times people have such a bad mindset going into these series versus these players that they're giving themselves even worse than a coin flip kind of situation. And it's just a totally bad foundation of mindset. And like I said, it just comes down to respecting the person you're playing. And if you just respect, hey, this guy's coin flips are pretty strong, I gotta do these builds, and then I gotta, work with it. Just these give me the best chance, and not just the best builds, but the best builds. It's not about the best build period, because like I said earlier, you have to do what you know, and you have to work within your workshop of builds. If you feel like you don't have enough variety or flexibility with the build orders that you have, maybe you need to get more. But of course, you have to be careful about getting too many, because if you have too many, then all of a sudden you have 10 builds and you're bad at all of them, right? But just knowing what you're good at and understanding your limitations, and not focusing so much on their bad aspects, but really respecting what they're good at, and understanding that they really become a lot more well-rounded when you consider the good with the bad, right? And if you can abuse all those weaknesses they have, that's perfect. But if you can't, don't force it just because you see how bad the bad is. You know what I mean? So what's really important is looking at those things objectively. And once you do that, it all becomes a lot more clear. You see things for how they are, and you can just play a series so much more efficiently, and you don't feel so robbed when you lose, because the bottom line is you're going to feel terrible when you lose no matter what. You know, if you're putting a lot of time into it, and or maybe all of your time into it, and you're in a tournament and you lose, you're gonna feel bad. That's okay, because we're not robots. You're gonna feel bad about losing to people. That's just how it is. And if you can take a good lesson from those games, that's great. But even if you get a good lesson, it's gonna still sting a little bit, and you're gonna feel tired, and it's gonna be rough. But it's more about what you're feeling in that sadness or anger, rather than the emotion itself. If you're feeling like they don't deserve this, or you're feeling like every series is your last series, and this is definitely still a huge problem. You know, if every series shouldn't feel like your last series just because you lost to one person or a couple people. You know, that's just not how it works. There's something much more going on there. But even if you do all the things right, it's still going to be very hard. You know, the way I like to say it is mindset is like a muscle. And if you stop going to the gym, you're going to get weak. Just like if you stop working on your mindset, you're going to get weak in your mindset. And you could be great for a whole week, and then you forget for a little while, and then it starts going downhill again, and then all of a sudden you're back to square one. You really have to be careful about what's going on and what you're really thinking about. And yeah, this is pretty much what all I had to say about ego and confidence. And if this just helps one person, then I'd be happy.